What if the loudest act of protest came with no noise at all? What if a cold sandwich on a first-class tray wasn't just a meal, but a message? Celeste Morgan, a black tech CEO with more power than most in that cabin would ever realize, didn't make headlines that day for what she said. She made history for what she didn't. One quiet moment, one deliberate tap of her smartwatch set off a chain of accountability that would shake the comfort zones of the privileged and expose the fine print prejudice baked into luxury. This wasn't about hunger. This was about erasure, about being told in the subtlest of ways that you don't belong, even after you've earned your seat. Celeste had faced it before, in boardrooms and briefings, but this time it happened 30,000 feet in the air, and instead of demanding respect, she documented the disrespect, not for drama, for justice. And that distinction, that's what made the fallout unstoppable. Leave a comment below to let us know where you are watching from, and if you like fascinating stories like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we have another incredible story, and there are many surprises waiting for you in the next parts. Flight 917 became more than a route from New York to Geneva. It became a mirror, and what it reflected was a culture far too comfortable with the quiet dismissal of black excellence. No slurs, no tantrums, just a policy weaponized through selective service, and a woman who decided not to let it slide. This story isn't just Celeste's. It's for anyone who's ever had to prove they deserved what was already theirs, for anyone who's ever chosen silence over conflict, then realized silence was the conflict. So if you've ever felt invisible in a room you worked twice as hard to enter, stay with me. Because this isn't just a story, it's a warning. And it all starts with a sandwich. Before the turbulence, before the audit codes and policy reforms, there was just a woman on a mission. Celeste Morgan lived a life most people would call exceptional, if they could see past the surface. To the outside world, she was polished perfection, a black tech mogul at the helm of a billion-dollar empire, the kind of woman Fortune magazine's spotlight and industry panels scramble to book. But even perfection carries its weight, and Celeste? She wore hers like a tailored blazer, tight at the seams, crisp, unyielding, but always impeccably in place. Her days began early, 5:30 a.m. sharp, with a cold press juice and a silent scan through global markets before sunrise. She didn't need an alarm clock. Her ambition had its own internal timer. Her penthouse wasn't lavish in the way tabloids like to portray. It was clean, intentional. Walls lined with books on behavioral science, AI ethics, and biographies of the underestimated. On her desk sat a framed photo, not of her at an awards ceremony, but of her mother, standing barefoot in a kitchen, apron dusted with flour, her eyes fierce with the kind of defiance that builds legacies. That was Celeste's compass, the reminder that excellence wasn't a goal, it was survival, refined over decades of having to be 10 times better just to be considered once. Morgan Tech's headquarters rose like a glass temple above Manhattan, its facade both transparent and reflective, a perfect metaphor for the woman behind it. Her team was loyal, not because of charisma, but because they knew she would never let them fail alone. There was Jamal, her head of research, who once stuttered through investor pitches until Celeste trained him by making him read Baldwin aloud every morning. There was Priya, the quiet coder from Queens, who had once almost quit after an investor mistook her for catering staff. Celeste made her lead the next board presentation and doubled her salary. Power in her world wasn't just top-down. It was redistributed through precision. Her leadership was meticulous, not warm, not cold, surgical, because kindness, to her, was never soft. It was structure, fairness, consistency. Still, for all the external order, there were cracks. Late at night, when the meetings ended and the skyline blinked quiet, Celeste would sit with a glass of Cabernet and let the weight settle. Not the weight of failure, She rarely failed, but the exhaustion of always having to prove her presence before proving her point. She remembered once walking into a Silicon Valley gala and being asked, twice, if she was someone's assistant. And she remembered how the temperature in the room changed when she introduced herself as the founder of Morgan Tech. It wasn't rage, she felt. It was erosion. The kind that doesn't crash like waves, but wears you down, grain by grain, until even your triumphs feel like battles. On the outside, her world ran like clockwork. But the truth? It was a tightrope. One misstep and the whole facade would shatter. That's what made first class more than just a cabin. It was her breath, her moment to exhale, to feel, just for 8 hours, like the world respected her without question. That's why the meal mattered. That lobster bisque wasn't just soup, it was earned acknowledgement. That steak wasn't just protein, it was a quiet nod to her presence. She didn't expect luxury. She demanded parity, and the cold sandwich wasn't just an oversight, it was the thread that unraveled years of stitched-together tolerance. The people around her rarely noticed. They weren't cruel, just comfortable, too used to the world adjusting for them. Radcliffe, Malcolm, Clayton. They weren't enemies. They were reflections of a system that prioritized familiarity over fairness. They didn't need to speak over her. The silence around her already said enough. That was the world Celeste lived in, where success was not armor but an invitation to new forms of erasure, where first class meant proximity to privilege, not protection from prejudice. And in that world, something had to give, not through protest, not through noise, but through consequence. And that, though no one on Flight 917 knew it yet, was exactly what was coming. The descent didn't begin with turbulence. It began with a smile. Thin, stretched, practiced. The kind flight attendants are trained to deliver, but this one cracked at the edges. Becky Whitmore approached with a tray, held like a peace offering. Celeste didn't move. She already knew. It was the eyes. That glassy politeness, the kind that doesn't look through you but around you. The kind that catalogs you without curiosity. "I'm sorry," Becky said, not sounding sorry at all. "But we've run out of your meal selection. All we have left is a cold sandwich and still water." Celeste looked at the tray, not because she was surprised, but because she needed to register every detail. The dry bread edges curling, the wilted lettuce like an afterthought, and the single plastic cup, half filled, sweating in its own mediocrity. She didn't frown. She didn't speak. She let the silence thicken, because this wasn't new. What stung wasn't the meal. It was the orchestration, the precision of dismissal wrapped in service. Around her, the cabin buzzed on, caviar cracked open in miniature tins, champagne flutes raised with whispered toasts, and yet she sat in seat 1A with the meal of a standby passenger who had barely made it to the gate. She could almost hear the unspoken rationale. She'll understand. She won't complain. She's too composed. That was always the gamble, wasn't it? That black dignity would cushion white discomfort. That silence would swallow slight. Inside her, something shifted. Not rage, not even resentment, just a clicking sound. Like a gear finally locking into place after years of slipping. She tapped her smartwatch once, not out of reflex, out of calculation. The screen blinked awake, not to check the time, but to access the encrypted backend Morgan Tech had designed to track internal systems across global partnerships. In 2 gestures, she had the crew manifest. Becky Whitmore, Senior Flight Attendant, ID STA-935. 2 past service complaints, both unresolved. She saved it quietly. No flourish, no announcement. Just a record added to a file that was already writing itself. The choice should have been simple. Ignore it. Dismiss it. She had a billion-dollar contract awaiting signature in Geneva. She was hours away from securing a legacy that could reshape European cybersecurity markets. The smart move? Stay focused. Don't stir the air mid-flight. Don't let a sandwich rewrite the narrative. But deep down, Celeste knew this wasn't about the food. It was about the pattern, the accumulation of cuts that had never healed. Today it was a meal. Yesterday it was being mistaken for the assistant. The day before it was being introduced last, even when she was the keynote. It was never loud. It was never obvious. That was the danger. It always arrived dressed like protocol. She looked out the window. Cloud banks floated past like indifferent cities in the sky. And she asked herself, as all strong women eventually must, am I going to let this one go too? Or am I finally going to answer the knock? The knock that comes when you've had enough. When silence feels heavier than the consequences of speaking. When the cost of comfort starts to look suspiciously like She thought of her mother again. The flower on her apron. The tired but proud eyes. The voice that once said, "Don't wait for them to give you space. Take it." Celeste breathed in deep. The air filtered, recycled, artificial. But the decision she made in that moment was the most real thing in the cabin. She would not accept the sandwich. Not this time. She would not let her presence be reduced to an afterthought served with shrink wrap. She would not validate a system that demanded her excellence but denied her humanity. But action wouldn't come through a raised voice or a public scene. That was their expectation. Instead, it would come through data, process, precision. She opened the Morgan Tech Internal Audit Protocol, drafted a query, linked the flight, the service manifest, the meal order discrepancy, cross-referenced it with a clause in Stratos Air's elite service promise. Then she added a note to Aaliyah Grant. Activate quiet audit. Start with STA 935. I'll handle the rest when we land. It was done in less than 60 seconds. No theatrics, no need for applause. But make no mistake, she had just declared war. Not on a person, but on a paradigm. And as she folded her arms across her chest, she wasn't just Celeste Morgan, tech CEO. She was the reckoning this system never saw coming, because sometimes the quietest passenger is the one writing the report that changes everything. The decision was already made when the tray hit the armrest. What came after was just the walk into it. For Celeste Morgan, it didn't matter that the plane hadn't landed. She had already crossed over. From patience to precision, from assumption to action. There was no going back to pretending that this was just about food or service. It was about architecture. An entire design built to erase people like her, while politely offering them a seat. Seat 1A, they called it. But what it stood for now wasn't privilege. It was proof. Proof that power, once earned, still had to fight to be recognized. The cabin lights dimmed into evening mode, casting a golden glow that softened the sharp edges of the first-class cabin. But there was nothing soft about Celeste anymore. Her eyes scanned the polished wood panels, the overhead bins with their brass accents, the passengers sipping wine like status was poured in the bottle. And then she noticed Becky gliding effortlessly between rows, stopping to chat longer with the men in 1C and 1D, laughing just a bit louder when they complimented her service, topping off glasses that were barely touched. Not once did her eyes drift toward 1A. Celeste could have been a coat in the closet for all she mattered in that performance. Her fingers moved again, quietly unlocking a deeper protocol embedded in Morgan Tech's global systems. This wasn't about personal retribution. It was about culture calibration. It was about teaching companies that if they wanted black brilliance in their boardrooms and on their planes, they'd have to deal with black boundaries, too. She accessed the airline's service compliance data from the last 12 months, looking for patterns, discrepancies in service based on customer demographics, response times, complaint outcomes. She wasn't just compiling notes. She was building a framework. And she didn't need to look angry to do it. The most dangerous thing in that cabin wasn't rage, it was a woman with receipts and resolve. A light touch on her shoulder interrupted the data stream. Daniel, the secondary attendant, leaned down. "Miss Morgan, can I get you anything else?" The tone was cautious now. The temperature had shifted. She looked up at him. "Yes," she said, voice even. "Tell me, what determines who gets priority when there's a shortage?" He blinked, unsure if it was a trap. I think it depends on the order date, and sometimes the crew makes judgment calls." She tilted her head, not unkindly. "Judgment calls," she repeated. "And are those judgments trained or personal?" He hesitated, mouth parting to answer, then closed it. "I'm not sure," he said at last. She nodded once. "Then thank you. That's all I needed to know." By now, the wheels were turning far outside the plane. Aaliyah had already received the encrypted trigger. Back in New York, the system was flagging anomalies, service disparities, racial bias indicators, complaint clustering by crew member, the kind of quiet, systemic infection that doesn't bleed but corrodes. And while the rest of the passengers leaned into their reclined seats, unaware, Celeste leaned into a war room built from algorithms and memory. This wasn't her first time being underestimated, but it would be the last time it went unchallenged at altitude. The hours passed like slow pages in a legal brief. Celeste didn't sleep. She watched, listened, studied every interaction. Becky refilled wine for 2 of 4 times, offered hot towels to every seat but hers, never once used her name. At some point, Daniel returned with a fresh bottle of sparkling water, placed it gently on her tray, and offered an apologetic smile, without apology. She accepted it not as kindness, but as confirmation. People knew when things were wrong, they just didn't always know what to do once it was exposed. Her thoughts drifted, not to anger, but to blueprint. She had once pitched a data security tool that could track insider bias in corporate environments. Investors called it paranoid software. That same tool was now mapping Becky Whitmore's behavior in real time. Every missed greeting, every skipped service, every tone-shifted interaction. Data points. What Becky thought was a smile and shrug was actually being plotted on a timeline. Celeste wasn't just walking into change, she was building the bridge behind her as she crossed it. Outside, dawn began to stretch across the Atlantic. The sky peeled back its darkness in soft blue streaks. Celeste sat up straighter. The descent would begin soon. Geneva awaited. Not just a city, but a stage. She refreshed the screen one last time. The report was ready, timed to send the moment wheels hit tarmac. Summary: probable behavioral discrimination. Crew member STA935. Pattern of selective service, cross-referenced passenger demographics. Attached: data logs, visual samples, video timestamps. Action recommended. Cultural audit, temporary suspension, leadership review. She closed the screen, folded her hands, not in prayer, but in stillness, the kind that precedes every earthquake. Celeste Morgan didn't fight with her fists. She fought with records, timestamps, inconsistencies, and the irrefutable weight of her dignity. And when Flight 917 touched down, her fight didn't end. It began a new round of challenges, and this time, she wasn't alone. Because in war, even one fought with calm words and cold stares. You learn quickly who's actually beside you and who's just standing nearby to watch the show. Stratus Air, the supposed summit of luxury, became her battlefield. But it was the silence, the trained silence of other executives, that told her the real war had just started. Not one apology in the boardroom, not one executive brave enough to say, "We've seen this before." They wanted her to fix the culture, but they didn't want to admit they'd built it. The first test wasn't the press, it was the board. They looked at her the way museums look at protest art, respectful from a distance, but never quite wanting to touch it. One of the regional directors, all silver hair and safe phrasing, said, "We need your insight, Miss Morgan. Help us improve the image." She let the words sit, unwrapped and undisturbed. Improve the image, not the issue. The first enemy, euphemism. The corporate kind. Celeste replied without blinking. "You don't need image consulting. You need cultural chemotherapy." The room froze, but a young HR director, probably mid-30s, leaned back in his chair and smiled faintly. His eyes said what his voice didn't. "Ah, finally." That young man, Jordan Cheng, would become her unexpected ally. Quiet, watchful, but sharp. He stayed after the meeting and handed her a flash drive. "I compiled something," he said. It was filled with anonymous complaints from crew members across international flights, coded language, pattern reviews, everything from meal service delays to gate discrimination. Celeste stared at the file like it was a blueprint. Jordan simply said, "If you ever need someone who's tired too, I'm here." That was how revolutions always started. Not with a megaphone, but a whisper, passed between two exhausted souls. But the real test wasn't inside the boardroom. It was outside, with the ones who felt exposed by her presence. Becky Whitmore hadn't just been suspended. She was angry, and that anger didn't disappear. Rumors began to circle. Celeste made it racial. Celeste wants attention. Celeste made up the order. All quiet enough to deny, but loud enough to damage. That's the game, after all. They don't drag you publicly. They dilute you quietly. The second enemy was narrative, the one they crafted without including her voice. But Celeste had seen too many stories rewritten by omission. So she did what only she could do. She told the story herself. Data first, emotion second. Truth wrapped in tone that couldn't be discredited. She went on one podcast. Just one. No major press, no headline hunters, just her voice, steady and piercing. This wasn't about food. This was about being served last, when you've done everything to arrive first. I don't want caviar, I want consistency. That clip went viral, not because she cried, but because she didn't. People believed her not for her pain, but for her precision. And suddenly the public, mostly women, mostly professionals, many black, began sharing their own Seat 1A stories. The flood of testimonies? That was the third test, because once the voices rise, everyone wants a savior. But Celeste never claimed that title, she said. "I'm not your hero. I'm your warning flare. Fix it, or the next passenger won't be as quiet." Meanwhile, allies surfaced from unexpected places. A flight attendant in Cape Town sent a letter. A former Stratus intern, now working at a tech startup, reached out with screen-captured chats of Becky mocking diversity quotas. Even a few pilots contacted her anonymously to say, "We see it, it's real, thank you." These weren't grand gestures, they were matches in the dark, but that's how you see what the system really fears. Illumination, and every small spark helped reveal what had been hiding in plain sight for years. But no journey runs smooth. The backlash was coming. Investors began murmuring. One board member wanted to limit her visibility. A PR firm suggested she soften the tone. Someone even leaked a photo of her smiling in Geneva with the headline, "Was it ever really about injustice?" That was the fourth enemy, perception manipulation. Not just what they say about you, but what they hope you'll believe about yourself. That maybe, just maybe, you're overreacting. Celeste responded with one line on social media. "When the system gaslights you, bring data. Then, bring fire." That post got shared 4 million times. Inside Stratus, policy changes were slow, resisted, reshaped into vagueness. They called it the 1A initiative, but Celeste called it what it was, accountability theater. Still, she kept showing up to meetings, kept rewriting training manuals, kept challenging passive silence, and with every pushback she gathered lessons. Not just for herself, but for the others coming behind her. That was the real reward, not revenge, not validation, legacy. Making sure the one sitting in seat 34F, row by the laboratory, would one day find themselves being welcomed with eye contact and equal service, not as an exception, but as the standard. Her greatest lesson? Allies aren't always loud, enemies aren't always obvious, and the biggest test isn't who stands against you, but who stands silently beside you, hoping you'll go away. But Celeste wasn't going anywhere. Not until every whispered injustice had been written down, counted, and turned into policy. And even then, she'd still be watching from seat 1A, calm, clear, and unmissable. Some ordeals come with noise, sirens, screams, public fallout. But others arrive disguised in boardroom lighting, woven suits, and polite smiles that mask institutional fear. Celeste Morgan's greatest challenge didn't come with a clear villain or one definitive moment. It was slower, more sinister, a kind of pushback, so polished it could pass for praise. She was now officially invited to serve as a cultural advisor for Stratos Air, a title meant to honor her, but secretly meant to contain her. They gave her a seat at the table, then tried to make her eat from the same broken tray they'd once used to dismiss her. They hoped her presence would appease the voices rising outside. What they didn't expect was that she wouldn't play along. The build-up began quietly. First came the scheduling delays. Meetings mysteriously moved, follow-ups accidentally missed. Then the memos. Drafted without her review but sent under her name, internal staff began tiptoeing around her, not because of respect, but fear of what she might see, what she might report. "Be careful," one senior director whispered. "You're shaking too many trees." Celeste looked him square in the eye. If the trees can't stand, they shouldn't be rooted. She knew what was happening. The system was trying to outlast her, delay her, tire her into silence, because if they couldn't defeat her with opposition, they would try to drown her in bureaucracy. Then came the meeting that would draw the line, a strategic review session with the Global Operations Board, 30 executives from every corner of the airline empire. They had prepared a glossy presentation of the Diversity in Luxury Service campaign, photos of smiling attendants, charts with minor upticks, a staged video of a black woman being offered a second towel. It was theater, and Celeste, seated at the center of the table in her crisp white blouse and charcoal blazer, said nothing as the slideshow clicked forward. Until it landed on a final slide. Progress achieved. Culture shifted. That was the moment. She leaned forward, quiet, measured, then asked, "What was the measurable drop in discriminatory incidents since the Seat 1A initiative launched?" Silence. She waited. What percentage of those reports were filed by crew? How many were escalated to HR? How many ended in disciplinary action? Still nothing. Then came the fumbling, the shuffling of papers, the throat clearing. Celeste didn't need to raise her voice. Her questions were bullets in a room full of porcelain. "This slide says we've made progress," she continued. "But your silence says you've made it prettier, not better." Someone tried to interrupt. She didn't let them. "You want my name on your brochure, but not on your protocol. You want the optics of change without the cost of transformation." That was the ordeal. Not being ignored, but being absorbed, being turned into decoration. And in that moment, Celeste knew she had to risk something bigger. Her position, her reputation, even the relationships she'd built. She stood up, looked around the table, and with that unnerving calm of hers, she said, "If you don't have the stomach to tell the truth in this room, you'll never have the spine to change what happens outside of it." Then she picked up her folder, nodded to no one, and walked out. That walk, silent, steady, uninterrupted, was louder than any protest. The immediate aftermath? Fire and ice. The media caught wind, not because she leaked it, but because someone in that room couldn't sit with the shame. A transcript was leaked. A clip of her statement circulated. Headlines returned. Morgan walks out of Stratus Air boardroom. CEO calls out diversity theater. Social media exploded again, but this time Celeste didn't respond. She let the truth hang in the air like perfume. Undeniable, lasting, impossible to scrub out. Inside Stratus, panic rippled. Investors called, employee groups organized, HR departments dug into every unattended complaint. A junior attendant came forward with her own experience, being told to deprioritize certain passengers based on tone. Others followed. The curtain had been lifted, and the stage was on fire. Stratus had a choice: cover the blaze or rebuild the set. Celeste didn't force their hand. She showed them what their hands had already done. But the transformation wasn't Stratus's. It was hers. She had long believed change came through persistence, policy, patience. But now she knew. Sometimes change only comes when you're willing to become the consequence of your own integrity. She wasn't just seat 1A anymore. She had become a mirror, one the industry couldn't look away from without first seeing itself. And for the millions watching, those who had been served last, spoken over, smiled at with dead eyes. Celeste Morgan wasn't just a story. She was a sentence written at the edge of a page that dared to bleed onto the next. She didn't bend. She didn't beg. She simply asked the question no system ever wants to answer. If you say you've changed, where's the proof? The reward didn't arrive wrapped in applause or endorsement deals. It came in the form of something far rarer: irreversible structural change. Stratus Air didn't just issue a statement. They rewrote their policy framework, line by line, naming the loopholes Celeste had exposed. Every flight attendant now underwent bias immersion training developed by an independent ethics council. Complaints were routed through a third-party AI system designed to detect subtle patterns of recurring prejudice. But more than all of that, the Seat 1A clause was born. An internal code adopted not just by Stratus, but by 2 additional luxury carriers within a month. It stated, "No guest shall be deprioritized due to perceived socioeconomic mismatch with the cabin class they've entered." Celeste didn't demand her name be attached to it, but it was. Quietly, formally, the world had shifted, but not in the way people expect when they think of reward. This wasn't about revenge. It was about precision. Celeste walked into the Geneva Leadership Summit weeks later and didn't need to be introduced. Delegates stood when she entered, not because she was famous, but because they knew they were standing in front of proof. Proof that change doesn't always look like banners and marches. Sometimes it looks like a woman in tailored navy, arms crossed, watching the old rules burn. Symbolically, her reward was a chair, one they gave her at the summit, etched with her initials. But she didn't sit in it. Not because she was being defiant, because she wanted others to see what happens when you outgrow even the space they offer you. That chair became its own story. Journalists wrote about it, attendants snapped photos. But Celeste never addressed it directly. She let the empty seats speak louder than she ever could. Yet even in triumph, the aftershocks came. In the weeks that followed, she received letters from young women in finance, in law, in medicine. Stories of subtle neglect, of quiet exclusion. Some asking for advice, some just asking if it would ever get better. Celeste read every one. She realized then that the reward wasn't the policy. It wasn't the public change. The reward was becoming someone that others could point to and say, her silence wasn't surrender, it was strategy. But reward has its own price. Celeste started receiving corporate invitations cloaked in praise, but built on coception. They wanted her for their keynote, their panel, their diversity photo. Come, inspire, they said, but never come build. She had to decide, was she going to become the mascot of a movement or its architect? The difference was subtle, but for her it meant everything. She chose the latter. She started declining events and began developing a cultural systems audit model instead, one that didn't just look at optics, but dug into the root logic of bias. Who is allowed to belong and who must prove it? Her perspective changed. The world didn't need more icons, it needed infrastructure. And that realization shifted her next steps. She was no longer reacting to what had been done to her, she was building frameworks to prevent it from happening again. Reward, in her case, wasn't the medal, it was the permission she gave herself to stop waiting for applause and start writing the blueprint. The most powerful moment came not in a press conference, but in a classroom. Celeste visited a charter school in Newark, where students had watched her speech and turned it into a writing prompt. A 15-year-old girl raised her hand and asked, "Do you think they would have listened if you'd cried instead?" Celeste paused, then replied, "They would have heard the sound, but they wouldn't have understood the message." Room, the way it went silent afterward, that was the echo of reward. Still, questions remained. What now? When the headlines fade and the seats are filled with new passengers, will the system remember what it once denied? Celeste didn't know. But she did know this: the cost of staying silent is always paid by the next woman who walks in and dares to ask for what she already earned. That was a price she would never pass forward. The reward, then, wasn't peace. It was purpose. And with that came a weight she carried gladly. Not to be seen, but to ensure others wouldn't have to fight just to be noticed. When Celeste stepped off the plane at JFK, there were no camera flashes, no red carpets, no crowds waiting with signs bearing her name. Just the chill of a New York winter slicing through her coat collar and the low rumble of a world that had kept moving. But this time she walked through arrivals not as someone returning from a business trip, but as someone who had changed the coordinates of what power looked like at 30,000 feet. And maybe more importantly, who it belonged to. Home hadn't changed. The skyline was still carved in steel, the elevator still dinged at the 42nd floor of Morgantech's headquarters, but Celeste had. Before, she had walked into that building to prove something, to the market, to the investors, even to herself. Now she walked in to build. Her office hadn't moved, but the silence inside it had. It was no longer the silence of isolation, it was the stillness of strategy, of foundation laying, of turning fury into architecture. Her assistant Aaliyah met her with updates, legal memos, and 3 invitations from other major airlines requesting consultations. But Aaliyah's eyes held something different. Respect, yes, but also familiarity. They were no longer just CEO and assistant. They were 2 women who had stared at the system, read its coded scripts, and responded not with noise, but precision. Celeste leaned on that dynamic now. The lone leader had returned with a team in mind. Back home, friends started noticing a shift in how she moved through conversations. She asked different questions. Less about quarterly gains, more about structural sustainability. She wasn't just interested in scaling anymore. She was interested in anchoring. Her dinner conversations turned philosophical. What does it mean to return to a place that hasn't changed while you have? How do you stop yourself from shrinking to fit the old frame? She didn't have answers, but she knew the questions mattered. There was, of course, the matter of unresolved threads. The private equity firm that once dismissed her tech pitch now sent an email asking for a catch-up call. The glossy magazine that had passed her over for a feature now asked to do a cover story. Her response was consistent, polite, distant, firm. She didn't need to perform gratitude for recognition that came late. She had learned, sometimes, what looks like a door opening is just a trap resetting. Her family noticed, too. Her mother, who had always said, "Don't cause trouble on planes," now held her hand and whispered, "Thank you for showing them you can fight without raising your voice." Even her younger cousin, studying business in college, started a group called the Seat 1A Circle to mentor Black women entering corporate America. The change was rippling even if the water at the surface seemed still. Returning also meant revisiting her own habits. The way she used to double-check her tone in emails. The way she'd over-explain technical concepts in board meetings, anticipating that someone would assume she hadn't written the algorithm herself. That's the quiet toll bias takes. Small edits to self, until your voice sounds less like you and more like what they expect. Now, she left those edits behind. Her voice returned, not louder, but clearer, undiluted. Yet reintegration wasn't about being applauded. It was about realignment. Celeste sat with her executive team and rewrote Morgan Tech's internal advancement rubric. Bias analysis was no longer a checkbox. It was embedded in promotion metrics. DEI wasn't relegated to a committee. It became an operational pillar, audited quarterly, tied directly to leadership performance. The revolution had returned home and asked, "Are you ready to live by what you demanded from others?" She also started mentoring again, not just women of color in tech, but people who had been quietly erased in systems that only pretended to see them: security staff, junior analysts, the night shift coders. She knew from experience the people you overlook on the way up are the ones who carry the weight of keeping the lights on. There were moments she'd sit at her window overlooking Manhattan, remembering the sandwich tray. Cold, dismissive, ordinary in its cruelty. That tray had become a symbol, but she never kept it metaphorical. She had it recreated in chrome and mounted on her office wall, not as a trophy, but as a trigger. A reminder that even in luxury, injustice is often served under the guise of professionalism. The biggest shift, though, was internal. Celeste had always known how to navigate rooms where she wasn't expected. But now, she wasn't navigating, she was redesigning the map. When she looked at her calendar, it was no longer packed with appearances. It was packed with policy meetings, system overhauls, strategic hires. She wasn't the star anymore, she was the infrastructure. And that, she realized, is the most powerful seat of all. She also had to make peace with the strange truth. Transformation is lonely. Not everyone clapped, not everyone understood. Some colleagues whispered that she had become too serious, that her edge was too political. But she didn't flinch. Because returning home means bringing truth with you, and sometimes truth clears the room before it fills it with the right people. In that clarity, she found peace. Not comfort, not ease, but peace. The kind that comes when you realize you don't have to be everyone's answer. You just have to be the mirror that makes the system see itself. And from that mirror, people can choose what they want to be next. The road back wasn't paved with validation. It was paved with responsibility. But Celeste walked it with the same posture she'd had in seat 1A. Composed, deliberate, unyielding, not because she needed to be right, but because she refused to let the world pretend it hadn't seen what it had clearly revealed. The first-class lounge at Zurich International was just as pristine, just as sterile, as the one Celeste Morgan had walked through 1,000 times before, but this time it didn't feel like marble and leather and glass. It felt like a mirror. Every step echoed, not just in the corridor, but in her memory. Every detail, from the polished espresso machine to the quiet hum of business travelers on calls, reminded her of a world she'd cracked but not yet rebuilt. And now that world was watching to see if she'd keep building or walk away. She sat alone as she often did, not out of isolation, but intention. Her phone buzzed. A notification. Seat 1A has been updated with new guest recognition protocol. Another. Cultural training, Phase 3, completed across 86% of Strata staff. She nodded once. Not with triumph, but with the silent affirmation of someone who knows revolutions don't end with applause. They end with infrastructure. Still, beneath that steady hum of progress, a new question had begun to form. What now? The answer came sooner than expected. An email. Not from an airline, not from a journalist, but from a 16-year-old girl in Baltimore named Mariah. The subject line read simply, "I think I saw myself for the first time." Her message was short. "I never knew I was allowed to expect more until I saw your story. Thank you." Celeste stared at the screen, her breath catching just slightly. It wasn't the praise. It was the realization that change doesn't echo in boardrooms. It echoes in mirrors placed in the right hands. But that email also brought something else. A challenge. Not an opponent to conquer or a scandal to unravel, but a deeper question. Was she building something that would last without her? Was her presence still necessary, or was it time to pass the baton? The final transformation isn't about winning. It's about letting go of the need to be at the center. And that terrified her more than anything else she'd faced. She boarded her next flight anonymously. No seat 1A, no champagne, no pre-ordered steak. She walked past the rows with ease and took her place in economy beside a mother traveling with her son. It was cramped, it was loud, it was utterly human. The boy kept fidgeting with the tray table, and the mother gave Celeste a tired smile that said, "Sorry," and "Thank you," and "Please don't judge me all at once." Celeste smiled back, gently helping the boy lock the tray. The mother mouthed, "Thank you." It was small, it was pure, and for the first time in a long time, Celeste felt the shape of her journey start to make sense. Because the real power wasn't in reforming first class. It was in making sure those in the back didn't feel like they had to stay there forever. That moment, insignificant to the flight manifest, was everything the summit of her journey had been about. The resurrection wasn't in retaking seat 1A. It was in not needing it anymore to prove anything. When the plane landed, she didn't walk out like a symbol. She walked out like a woman ready to become something more dangerous. A teacher. She took on fewer speaking engagements and more mentorship roles. She launched a private fund, not just for startups, but for service workers with ideas that had been ignored. And she began visiting high schools. Not the elite academies, but the forgotten buildings in cities that had long been treated like transit stops for ambition. In one of those classrooms, she told a story. Not about the airline, but about a time in college when her professor returned her code with a note that read, "You must have copied this. It's too advanced." She had smiled then, even as it hurt. She told the students, "People won't always recognize what you've built, but the moment they try to erase it, you'll know it's real." One girl in the back raised her hand and asked, "What do you do when they never say sorry?" Celeste didn't pause. You stop waiting. You build something they have to see anyway. The final conflict was never Becky Whitmore. It was the idea that validation must come from the same place harm did. And the resolution wasn't a policy change or a press release. It was this. Celeste had stopped needing recognition and started recognizing herself. Not the image others projected. Not the title. Just the core of her. Resilient, deliberate, compassionate. She had emerged from the chrysalis not just with wings, but with direction. In her final public appearance that year, she didn't speak at a summit or conference. She spoke at a graduation ceremony for a vocational school. The students were mostly women, mostly poor, mostly invisible. She told them, "They'll tell you you're too angry, too sensitive, too loud, too quiet. Smile anyway. Not for them, for you. Because survival is quiet, but thriving makes noise." She ended with this line, "You don't need to sit in seat 1A. You just need to remember, no one flies this high by accident." As the crowd stood to applaud, Celeste stepped back, letting their joy wash over the moment, not her. Her eyes scanned the room, not for fame, but for fire. For the next young woman who would sit where she had, unnoticed, underestimated, and entirely unstoppable. The final transformation wasn't in what Celeste did, it was in who no longer had to do it alone. And that truly was the resurrection, not of one woman's power, but of everyone's permission. Leave a comment below to let us know where you are watching from, and if you like fascinating stories like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we have another incredible story, and there are many surprises waiting for you in the next parts.